So, yeah.
Well, we're actually going to be taking questions in groups as we go through.
Oh, we are? Okay.
Yeah, because what we're going to do, if you could kind of look at this diagram that I've got, what we're going to be doing is we're going to go and talk about, I'm going to run through this at the beginning. We're going to do like 3 tools, and then we're going to take a Q&A. If there are any questions on those 3.
Yeah.
And then we're going to move on. So we're going to do it in like 4 groups rather than just, so the slides then do the first one, group 1. Beth will run through those, and then we'll get, and then say, let's do a quick Q&A on those to take a pause.
Okay.
And then and then go from there, and then go into group 2. So it's not like we're having to wait. Folks don't have to wait right to the end to ask questions.
Oh, okay. So maybe I can say, before you start, you can say like we'll be doing these groups.
Yeah. I'll introduce that, and then are we going to see their questions?
Yeah. Let's see. Not from there. I think you can see them from.
So I'm going to have to start. So it is better for me to.
Yeah, I can also watch them from I have my laptop, and I can watch them from my laptop and just read them out loud.
Now I could actually log into the Zoom from my laptop.
Yeah.
Should I do that?
Sure.
Okay, great. That was your email that you sent yesterday, right?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Beth, have you got that too? You're in the Zoom, right?
I'm in the Zoom. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to do that because I'm in your SCAG
Okay.
guest Wi-Fi. It seems to be working. Okay, got it. Beautiful.
Oh, so it looks like you're controlling from your laptop?
That was me.
Oh, okay, great. I was about to ask. So can we get it where the screen on our end shows the comments, and then, but on the, do you know what I mean? The presenter, she sees like the comments going on.
So we can join the podium laptop. It's like if we join the podium laptop to the Zoom, then everyone everywhere will see the questions. Is that?
He can, no, that's okay. He can see the questions. So, yeah, we're fine how it is. And then, yeah, it's a little early. Good morning, everyone. We'll be getting started in just a short moment. Thank you. Good morning. Welcome to SCAG Toolbox Training. We have a webinar today on adapting transportation to global climate change. And we're going to be hearing from Dr. Robert Kay and Beth Rodehurst of ICF on their climate resilience toolbox. And after that, we'll be hearing from SCAG's Grieg Asher on our Green Region Initiative, on our Southern California Adaptation Framework. We will be having rounds for questions, which Robert will be explaining in a moment. Please, if you have questions, type them into the chat box and I will be reading them aloud to the group. All right, thank you. We can take it away.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Rob Kay from ICF Consulting, and I'm here with Matt and India in SCAG Global HQ. Thanks for welcoming us here. On the line is my colleague Beth Roadhorst. Do you want to say hi, Beth?
Hi, everyone. This is Beth Roadhorst with ICF.
Thanks, Beth. So we're looking forward to running through the toolbox work that we've done with SCAG. What I'm going to do is just quickly jog through the agenda, and then I'm going to throw it to Matt and ask him to talk about why the toolbox was created. Then what I'm going to do is do a high-level overview of the toolbox itself, and then from there go in and do a deep dive. And that's when Beth is going to come online. And the way that we're going to do that is that there are groups of these tools. There are 4 of them. And the approach that we are going to take here is that Beth's going to run through like the first group of these, and then we're going to just pause for a Q&A on those, and then we'll move on to the next group. So please, as we're going through each of these individual tools, and I'll let you know when we start to do that, please put your hand up or type into the chat box. I'm set up here to have a look at what those questions are, and I'll either field them directly or ask Beth to respond at that time. Okay, Matt.
Good morning, everyone. This is Matt Gleason with SCAG, and I was the SCAG project manager on the Toolbox project that we're discussing today. And I was hoping just to really lay out what we were thinking when we decided to create this toolbox. And basically, between 2011 and 2012, 2013, there was a kind of a confluence of events that really got our team, the Transit and Rail team, thinking about the impacts of global climate change and natural disasters on the transportation system. Particularly on the one hand, we had the impacts of Superstorm Sandy on the East Coast, which really had a large and negative impact on the transportation network there. And also at the same time, there was beginning to be a set of resources for thinking about the impacts of climate change on the transportation system. Both locally, the Los Angeles Regional Collaborative had produced a set of mid-century forecasts. And also ICF and other groups had been working with the federal government, particularly FHWA, to put together frameworks for beginning to think about assessing adaptation and resilience to the impacts of global climate change. So we thought it was kind of a good moment for SCAG to get involved and kind of begin to think about how we could produce resources for local transit agencies and also our member cities to begin to incorporate these issues into their long-range planning. So as a result of that, we went out and we applied for a Caltrans 5304 transportation planning grant, which we were awarded. And after some time, we were able to bring our partners at ICF on board to produce this resource, this set of resources, really. And we think they've done some great work, and we think it could be useful to all kinds of local agencies, which is why we've invited you to this webinar today. So with that in mind, I just want to kind of highlight how using the resources in this toolbox can also help local agencies. I think what was great about the project is Rob and Beth were able to really think critically about how you can incorporate the risks of global climate change into the work you're already doing. And the toolbox is designed to do that. It's designed to think about, okay, well, we know that there could potentially be these impacts from a changing climate. How do we take the work we're doing in terms of developing our long-range capital programs, in terms of doing risk assessments or environmental mitigations, and incorporate those risks into that process? And I think As Beth is going to go over, this is something that can save you time, save you money, and help you to really do the background work to go out and really fight for grant money. And so with that said, I'm going to turn it over again to Rob, and thank you for joining us.
All right, thanks, Matt. Okay, so just riffing off of what Matt was saying, the project team was ourselves. We led the effort together with our partners, Climate Resolve and Nelson Nygaard. For those of you that don't know Climate Resolve, they're an LA-based NGO and very well respected in the work that they do around outreach, engagement, and so on around climate mitigation and adaptation issues. And they also helped in the project on looking at granting opportunities as well down the line. Nelson Nygaard were our partners on the transit side. I'm sure you know them as a transit-oriented consulting firm. Process that we went through, as Matt was saying, is this collaborative process of bringing our experience of developing toolkits for other clients, together with the emerging best practice in this field, and which we'll run through in a minute, together with the technical analysis that we're able to do, bringing in the climate change projections and so on. But really, the idea is to blend those together into the tools that we're going to run through. So just to give you a quick high level of the toolbox, first up, this is the URL to find all of these tools. So if you're listening to this and you have two screens where you're listening into, it might just be worth, if you haven't already, you can click on this link and find the live toolbox items that we're going to run through. So as Matt was just saying, the goals are on the left-hand side. It's really to lower these barriers, just to make this easier to do fundamentally, to look at identifying critical assets and routes, to think about how to integrate climate considerations into planning, and then to pivot that into actually implementing adaptation practice on the ground. So this is very much starting with the end in mind, thinking about, well, what is the best way to support the decisions that are currently being made and that are likely to be made in the near future by transit agencies in the SCAG region. So on the right-hand side, just saying what the toolbox is, it's a collection of resources aimed at helping transit agencies. It's not a prescriptive step-by-step guide in how to do this work. It was not intended as that. Nevertheless, we think it's incredibly helpful to provide the overarching approaches to how you would do this, again, to lower the barriers into getting into this work. So I'm just going to dwell on this for a second, because this is a really important slide. It basically sets the framework for the rest of the webinar. The toolbox is organized into the four major categories. And if you just focus your gaze onto the little green numbered circles on the right-hand side, you can see starting at numbered 1 through 11. These are the individual toolbox resources that we're going to run through on this webinar. So there are 11 of them. They're individual discrete tools that are available on the toolkit website. Each of those then are organized into these four categories, which is the all caps text in the middle. So they are in the reading from the top, and the getting started categories. There's 3 tools there. Then the next group is assessing vulnerabilities and consequences. Again, 3 tools there. The next group, identifying and evaluating adaptation strategies, and there's 2 tools there. And then finally, moving towards implementation. Again, 3 tools in that group. So the actual titles of each of those tools is on this slide. It's just expanded a little bit. You can see there on the right-hand side there in the Getting Started section of the group of the toolkit. The first 3 are projected changes in climate and SCAG region and so on. So what we're going to be doing is jogging through each of those groups of tools now.
Thanks, Rob.
Okay, over to you, Beth.
Thank you. All right, so we're going to start with the first group, the 3 tools related to getting started, which included the projected changes in climate in the SCAG region. Number 2, which is assessing vulnerability and consequences and getting started. And 3, integrating climate change into transit planning processes. And all 3 of these resources, like I said, they're in part of this getting started grouping. And so this is really as you are thinking about, at early stages, how to start evaluating your vulnerability, how to start, you're articulating your goals and figuring out the process that you're going to use. These are 3 resources that might come in handy. Next slide. So we'll start with the first one, which is projected changes in climate in the SCAG region. And so just kind of purpose of this resource is that we have found in various work that we've done with vulnerability assessments that sometimes retrieving and making decisions about climate data and data sets, processing the data and mapping it against the assets can really require a lot of resources. It requires a certain level of technical expertise to really understand which data sets to use and making decisions on timeframes and models and emission scenarios. And then there's just the manpower, the labor hours that come into just actually getting the data and processing it and developing maps. So we thought one of the easiest way to help reduce a barrier and reduce these resource requirements for individual transit agencies is that we could just do the work for you. So we did. So what we did was we pulled climate change projections and mapped them against the SCAG resources that are in the area. So we overlaid the projections with the transit data, which includes bus and rail lines in the SCAG region. So this resource is really a starting point for understanding exposure. We focus on the mid-century climate projections just because mid-century just aligns better with people's decision-making horizons than later scenarios. And we look at 3 hazards that were of particular interest in the SCAG region, which are extreme heat, sea level rise, and extreme precipitation and inland flooding, and then overlaid it with the transit assets. And so this is a resource that has, there's high resolution maps that shows these resources and the transit assets across the SCAG region. And the reason you might want to use it is that it's just this ready-made resource that can give you a very quick understanding of how the climate in your area is projected to change. You can help you identify their specific areas where you have transit assets that might be, particularly exposed to a major climate hazard. And so it's a starting point to just it doesn't really get to at risk as much as it's just a starting point to understand where you need to look a little more closely. Eventually you may or may not need to do a detailed exposure assessment, but this, for most people's purposes, this information is usually sufficient for at least getting started on the vulnerability assessment and understanding really where they may be exposed. So next slide. So here's some example ones. I'll run through them quickly. These are all in the resource. So this is the mapping of the heat. In general, the heat waves are expected to be hotter, last longer, occur more frequently, and be more widespread. Inland areas in particular are expected to experience some pretty significant increases. We're talking several more weeks per year of what's considered an extreme heat day. And so this map just shows how that may look across the region. Next slide. We also map sea level rise, and so there's a lot of the SCAG region that is not along the coast, but for the areas along the coast, there are specific areas where sea level rise might be an issue. So areas like Ventura, Playa Vista, Long Beach, and Northern Orange County in particular had some areas that may have some exposure to sea level rise. Next slide. So there's this, we call it the threshold for what's considered extreme precipitation, which is, and that's expected to increase. So that means what, if you looked at like what, the wettest day of the year, how much precipitation that would be, that is going to increase over time. We're also expecting more dramatic swings. So some years would be more dry than usual, whereas others would be more wet. So this is something referred as precipitation whiplash, which has its own issues associated with it. The average annual number of what we consider a heavy precipitation day is expected to stay roughly the same. Again, that's an average. So once you average it across many years, it really looks to be about the same. But like I said, there's going to be more of these swings. So some are dry and some are wet. Next slide. And some areas in the SCAG region have transit assets in floodplains, such as Long Beach, Coachella Valley, in the Western Imperial County. It's difficult to determine exactly how climate change may affect these particular floodplains, but in years that there are more intense precipitation events, these are the areas that are likely to get hit either first or more severely. Next slide. So going on to tool number 2, this is assessing vulnerability and consequences, getting started. So one of the things that we already knew is that there's a number of vulnerability assessment frameworks out there already. We didn't want to create yet another one that you guys would have to figure out, which one to follow, follow this one or follow this one, how do they relate? But that said, we thought there were some really good tips that and best practices that have emerged over the last few years, and we wanted to share that. And so, like we said before, this is never meant to be like a step-by-step how-to guide for conducting a vulnerability assessment or an adaptation plan, but this sort of brief resource is a great thing to read through as you're just getting started and making decisions about what approaches to take. So this resource outlines some key considerations in getting started. So the main categories are listed in these bullets. So one is to clearly articulate your vulnerability assessment goals, because really if you think about the end, if you have the end in mind, that really will dictate a lot of your approach and help you identify where to invest more resources, where to invest less resources in terms of completing an assessment. There's often ways to refine your assessment early on. So you can go back to the first resource that has exposure, and you might decide based on that you're really worried about heat and not precipitation, or you're on the coast and maybe it's really the sea level rise that you're really concerned about, and you might be able to focus it that way. You might see that there's certain aspects of certain parts of your transit system that are particularly exposed, and you might want to focus on those areas. So there's ways to refine it so that you're not assessing everything and spending resources on things that ultimately aren't helpful. We also list some existing vulnerability assessment frameworks and methods out there, like I mentioned. So we give a kind of a quick overview of some of the ones that are commonly used in the transit sector and some of the benefits of using one versus another. But it might be just a good way to get started when you're studying your approach. There's information on how to obtain and interpret the climate data appropriately. So if you do need to go beyond what we provided in the first resource, there's some tips about making decisions in terms of, just general, like how to interpret the data and understand the terms that are used and where to get it. And then resources for applying the vulnerability assessment results and really understanding what to do with them once you have those results. So yeah, and so this is just something that's it's a short resource. It's good to read through before you really just get started. All right, next slide. So then the third resources focus on integrating climate change into transit agency planning processes. And so this is, again, we know a lot of transit agencies have really limited resources. So the idea of undertaking a whole new adaptation planning process, it can be really intimidating. But all agencies already have existing processes that, whether directly or indirectly, somehow manage risk. And so transit, it's already outside, it's already exposed to weather and the elements. People are already thinking about how to manage severe weather or changing weather. And so that's baked in. And so it's really kind of leveraging that foundation and saying, okay, well, now we need to take it a step farther and think about future climate. But we can still leverage these existing resources because we're already thinking about this in some way. And so the idea here is if we can really leverage these existing processes, then it's just going to be a lot easier to get this done and more cost effective. So for this one, we chose 3 common transit agency processes that most agencies will have some form of one way or another, maybe not all. There's certainly other processes, but these are the main ones that we thought were relevant. So procurement and contracting, transit asset management, and short-range transit plans. And so once you understand what your vulnerabilities are and you're ready to explore how to adapt and prepare for these vulnerabilities, you can look through these processes and understand, okay, well, this is how we might work in the concept of climate change as we go through the steps. And so Rob, if you go to the next slide, I think we have an example. And so here's an example where basically we map out the common steps within the processes, and then the green circles show the various ways that we call them climate entry points. And so it's where you can start thinking through how to integrate climate change into these processes. And so in this case, like when you identify the need, you're really thinking through, well, what is the need that's related to climate change? Later on, the planning department does an assessment to help verify that the need is actually, truly a priority for the agency. And that's where we can help verify that there is a need for resilience investment. The next step is determining what the funding source might be. So it's really just taking through these common steps and breaking it down and thinking through, okay, well, let's look at this through the lens of climate change. Okay, next slide.
All right. Thanks, Beth.
Sure.
So please just, I just gave everyone on the webinar a heads up that we're going to come to this Q&A time. So if there's any questions, if you could just type them into the chat box. I'm just having a look at that now. Just while you're having a think about any immediate questions, Beth, just a question from me. I mean, this was finished and uploaded in middle of last year, and since then we've been doing a lot of work with in the region, including with San Bernardino County and with LA Metro and others. I mean, how have things changed in these sets of tools since they were finished last year?
Yeah, so we're always refining the processes a little bit, and we are currently updating the adaptation planning guide that Cal OES manages. So that'll be a new resource coming out soon that has more updated guidance. And the thing that has really become a focal point is really trying to harness more best practices for what comes after the vulnerability assessment. I think there's a lot of people who feel there's a lot of resources out there for vulnerability assessments and best practices are emerging, but there's more guidance that's needed for, okay, we know what's vulnerable, now what do we do? So I think in the coming year or two, I think we're going to start seeing a lot more resources focused around that. And the resource number 3 that I just showed, that was about integrating the process. I think that's something that in general we've gotten good feedback on. And I think that resource in particular will be helpful, and we'll probably see more things similar to that in the future.
Thanks, Beth. And we've got a question from Iris. Are you able to pull out the data within a jurisdiction boundary?
Mm-hmm. So what's online right now on the website is a PDF of high resolution maps. I mean, we do have the data, and I don't know if Matt's still there with you in the room, but it might be more of a question for him of how people might be able to access the data.
Thanks, Beth. Yeah, we do have a set of high resolution maps we're going to be putting on the website as well. In terms of scaling down to the jurisdictional level, we didn't integrate that for this work effort, but I think Greg Asher is going to be speaking later about the next step in terms of climate adaptation that SCAG's working on, which probably is in closer partnership with local jurisdictions, and maybe he could touch on that for us. Or when you, or later.
Hi, everyone. Greg Asher here with SCAG. Yes, I'm going to be sort of giving a high-level overview of our next big adaptation effort here, which is a regional framework. And that will involve working with the cities, local governments, and not specifically any group of agencies like transit agencies or water agencies. So we will have access to, or we will be developing some mapping as well that cities can sort of zoom in on their jurisdiction and take a look at their particular vulnerabilities or climate risks. I suppose that eventually, I don't know if it'll happen in this next stage, but I think you could eventually do something like overlay transit facilities and routes maybe in a city, particularly, and then on the local level, and then take a look at some of the vulnerabilities that might be affecting the transit properties. So I'm not sure that we'll get to it, but I'm sure that's something that our GIS department could eventually do, is take these different map layers that that you guys have developed here and the ones that we're going to be developing next year, and sort of start playing with those and overlaying them, and we'll probably get some interesting and useful results.
That's a really good point. We do have shape files, and we can work with our GIS team. If you have particular data requests, please feel free to contact us. We can work with our GIS team to help facilitate that. And maybe as an additional next step, as Greg mentioned, there's something we can do along those lines.
Great, thanks. There's another follow-up question from V. Waskow. Can you provide the link to where the data maps are located?
Sure. As I mentioned, we are in the process of uploading a new edition of high resolution maps onto the website. And I believe Rob did put the link to the toolbox on the first slide in this presentation, but we can also mail out a link to the site, to the page on our website to everybody who's registered after the meeting.
Yeah, and Beth being the, yeah, I just saw that. Beth, do you
I just put it in the chat box.
Yeah, fantastic.
Thanks, Beth.
Great. Well, look, thanks, Iris, and thanks V Waskow for the questions. Let's move on then to the next group then, Beth. Back to you.
Okay, thank you. Matt, I think you need to mute the speakers in your room. All right, thank you. So then going to the next batch of resources, this relates to assessing vulnerabilities and consequences. So we have 3 resources here about how to obtain detailed climate projection data, assessing criticality, and a sensitivity matrix. So you go to the next slide, Rob. So this is the first one. Resource number 4 is about obtaining the detailed climate projection data. And so, as I mentioned before, the first tool has this high-level exposure data, and to be honest, this will be sufficient for a lot of people who are just trying to identify how the climate is changing in general. But depending on what sort of assessment you're doing, you might need more detailed data. It may need to be much more specific, or looking at more specific years and timescales, or you may be interested in a range of projections across different emission scenarios and models and things like that. So we wanted to provide some guidance related to how to do that. There's a lot of different options for where to get data, and also a lot of different decisions you have to make when pulling that data. Things like what timescales are appropriate, what climate models you should be using, what emission scenarios you should be looking at. And so we really did want to provide some guidance because it can be overwhelming. So, there's basically 4 steps in this guidance, and step 1 is identifying your climate data needs. And so this is kind of a lesson learned that we developed over the last several years to doing vulnerability assessments, is that if we sort of not really understand upfront exactly what we needed, we ended up spending too much time and money obtaining data that we ultimately didn't need. And so, or, you know, worst case scenario, you spend a lot of time and money obtaining data that just ends up not being that useful, and you don't have what you really need at the end. So we talked through some of the key questions you ask yourself before just diving in it, because you don't want to just borrow what someone else did, because someone else might have taken a very specific approach that was great for their needs, but that approach does not necessarily translate to what you need. So there's some common questions to ask yourself to figure out, like, what do we really need from the climate data? Step 2, determine climate data parameters. So this gets at the decisions I just mentioned that you need to make. Like, it gets at, like, well, what time frames do you use, emissions do you assume in the future? There's many different climate models out there. How do you choose them? How do you make all these decisions? So we provide some guidance on how to do that. And there's obtaining the climate data, and it's where to go and where to get it, and really how to think through even how to process it and use it. And then step 4 is about contextualizing uncertainty. And so anytime you're projecting anything in the future, there's a certain amount of uncertainty involved. And I think that can sometimes be a little intimidating when you think about, well, we don't really know for sure, 100% certainty, how the climate's going to change, and yet we want to make decisions about it. But when we break it down into the different types of uncertainty to help you really understand, well, how much uncertainty is there and how much does this matter? And so there are certain things, like some climate hazards have more uncertainty around them than others, like temperature in general has less uncertainty, things tend to agree, precipitation has a little more. There's uncertainty about really, will emission trends, change in the future, and what does that mean? And it talks about how to manage those kind of uncertainties. There's also the uncertainty of in the future, what we're doing today, the future today is not going to look anything like today, no matter what we do. So when you think about, especially when you're looking out to end of century, that is, 80 years from now. Think back 80 years ago and how transportation looked 80 years ago. It was really different. So the idea that, there's different needs, there's going to be different technological advancements. So there's uncertainty about really even what impacts and consequences might be related to climate change. But that doesn't mean that people should be paralyzed and not take action. There's ways to manage this uncertainty, things like making sure you understand appropriate ranges of the low or the high scenario and what that might mean. It's being reassured that we make decisions based in uncertain data all the time, whether it's traffic modeling, demographic predictions. There's a lot of decisions being made on a daily basis throughout our community based on uncertain projections. And it's just making sure that you're not locking yourself into anything too expensive and too locked in, and inflexible before you start getting some more data points along time, and being flexible, how to be flexible as you move along and make decisions as you find out more information. So this resource really focuses on how to provide all that in context. And so use this when you're ready to develop climate projections beyond those first provided in the first tool in the toolbox. Next slide. There's a tool on assessing criticality. And so this was developed as a resource to help focus in a vulnerability assessment. There's so many, and especially when you get into well, what is an asset? Is it literally, is it a bus? Is that the asset? Or is it the components of a bus, and that's the asset? Roads are usually not owned and maintained by transit agencies. So do you count those as assets or not? But they're pretty vital to a bus system actually working. So it's things like that. It's just thinking through, okay, well, what are the assets? But to try to assess in detail how every single one of the assets in your system that you rely on is vulnerable can be a little overwhelming and can take a lot of money. And in the end, ultimately, you probably don't need to assess everyone. There's ways to think through, okay, what are our critical assets? And let's focus on those first. Like, which are the ones, like whether it's a bus route or whether you define it as a type of equipment or a particular bus type of bus itself, like what are the things that are truly essential to the running of our system, and figuring out a way to articulate those and figure out which ones are most essential. And so this resource is developed to help you do that. And so there's a guidance document and an Excel tool related to this. And the Excel tool really, it's kind of a scoring tool that it'll ask you a series of questions and ask you to provide some, general scores. It's not super scientific, but it's just, understanding like just relative. It asks you a series of questions and asks you to rank things for different assets. And at the end, it'll help you rank what assets are most critical based on those answers. And so you would use this resource either right before getting started on a vulnerability assessment or even during the vulnerability assessment, like I said, to help you really focus what you're working on. So next slide, Rob, I think we have an example. So this is an example of a matrix where it would walk you through some more detailed questions, but you would basically score these common asset categories on severity, ridership, and connectivity, and it gets you an overall score. This particular matrix shows the bus asset categories that are common. There's one for rail as well. Next slide. And here are the evaluation criteria. So you would score it, you give these points based on your answer to the questions for each of the assets. Next slide. There's also a sensitivity matrix. And so when it gets to assessing vulnerability, it's really important to understand how different types of transit assets are sensitive to climate. There's a lot of transit agencies that have already completed climate change vulnerability assessments. So they've done a lot of the legwork, a lot of the research for you. It's compiled. So we don't want people to feel like they had to start from scratch and like with a blank page in front of them and say, okay, well, here are all the ways we are potentially sensitive to these, to this climate exposure. And so we've compiled that all in one document for you so that you can build upon the work and save a lot of resources instead of recreating it. So it's an Excel workbook. It describes specific rail and bus asset sensitivities across the categories of assets related to temperature, precipitation, and flooding and sea level rise. And that you use this while you're conducting the vulnerability assessment. Next slide. And here's just a snapshot of one of them. It's the buses. You can see there's the asset categories broken down. And then it just runs across like temperature, precip, and has the other types of hazards farther down if you were to scroll over in the workbook. But it lists and documents the research that goes behind the ways that all these different types of asset categories are potentially sensitive to these hazards. Next slide. All right, Q&A. Any questions on that group?
Beth, I'm not seeing any at the moment, but maybe I can just jump in while folks are taking a second. You mentioned this trying to avoid paralysis by analysis with the tools here of thinking deeply about the types of uncertainties and the types of issues that are being faced in this field without that necessarily stopping you. Is there anything you just want to pick out there in the way in which the tools were structured?
Yeah, I mean, first off, we're really trying to structure them so to help people get beyond the initial steps of vulnerability assessment and the exposure data and just asset collection data, because that was something, it was a lesson learned in the industry, I think, in the early years that people did vulnerability assessments, is that people would spend literally a year or two and 90% of their project resources just to get climate data down or to get a full list of assets down. And so these resources are meant to try to like help you cut through that and to really focus. You know, not only did we collect some of that exposure data and process it for you already, but even if that's not quite what you need, it's really, these documents are to help you focus and think through the scoping and kind of that start with the end in mind concept, so that you can move quickly through the first steps and not get stuck. And then the you know, paralysis by analysis, I think, is a good term. I refer to it as death by data sometimes, where there's just overwhelming amounts of data that, and you just get stuck there. But as I mentioned earlier, I think there's a lot more, sorry, can you mute, Rob? Thanks. There's a lot more emphasis on kind of moving past the vulnerability assessments now and what comes next, and thinking through the decision-making aspect. And so I think that's really gets to, and we'll see some more resources for that later on, but also that document I showed you with like the decision-making process is broken down. It's really to think through, well, how do we as an organization make decisions? What data do we need to make those good decisions? And how do we constantly evaluate our system for, you know, identifying, well, like what are the red flags that are showing that there's potentially a problem as the climate changes, and how do we prepare for that? So that you're not locked into anything immediately early on that's going to be really expensive, but that you're constantly evaluating your need and adjusting as time goes by. And Rob, if you have anything to add to that, please feel free.
No, that was great. Thanks, Beth. That was a great summary. Look, I'm not seeing any more questions. So, Beth, are you ready to roll through to group 3?
Let's do it.
All right. Over to you.
All right, great. So this group 3, gets at identifying and evaluating adaptation strategies. And so it includes just 2 resources in this case. There's some example adaptation measures and then tips for selecting and implementing those measures. Next slide. So first, we have the example adaptation measures. And this is just, it's really like a kind of a laundry list of adaptation measures that transit agencies elsewhere have either implemented already or who have considered and researched in their own adaptation planning processes. And it's really to help get you started thinking through what's possible, because you'll find that a lot of agencies, transit agencies, and honestly transportation agencies more broadly, like a lot of times you're facing the same sort of potential vulnerabilities. And so it's helpful to have a starting point of like, okay, well, here's what someone else thought through. It's by no means an exhaustive list of all possible ways to deal with something, but it's a really good start so that you're not starting from scratch. And so this resource is a Word document that includes a description of general types of transit adaptation measures. And so we included this here because I think sometimes when people think about adaptation, they automatically think we have to protect, and we have to build something bigger and stronger and like protect it. And that's certainly one way to approach it, but there are other ways. And sometimes it's about, okay, well, we can't feasibly protect ourselves 100% from these climate stressors. So how do we but maybe it's easier and better and more effective to make operational changes. And so an example might be, instead of trying to prevent a flood from happening along a route, which would be really difficult to do, perhaps, you can have operational adjustments where you're redirecting and rerouting buses, but part of that requires maybe, you know, better monitoring of a situation so you can adjust faster, or better communication so that your riders know where to go, maybe better signage, something like that. There's also a recovery element, for example. So a bus line was disrupted due to a flood and there's just nothing you could do about that. That happens, but how do you recover really quickly? How do you communicate that to the riders and services back to normal? So it's not always, so we included these different categories of adaptation measures, because we do want to encourage people to get out of the mindset of like we're just insulating ourselves from anything bad happening, because that's not realistic in most cases. But you can really affect and really minimize consequences overall if you have good, plans for adjusting to and reacting to and recovering from those sort of climate events. And then we also listed all the specific adaptation measures that fall within these categories. We tag them by the type of measure. Some of them fall within different categories, and we indicate which transit agencies that have actually either implemented them or thought about implementing them, just as a resource so you can know, who did this and potentially reach out to them if that's helpful. And so the point at which you would use this resources is when you're actually developing an adaptation plan or just starting to think about adaptation measures. So after you've completed your vulnerability assessment and you have a good handle on what your vulnerabilities are, you start thinking through, okay, well, what do we do next? Next slide. Here's a screenshot of the table. The dots represent the 6 adaptation categories that we identified, and then we list the specific measures and what they mean. Next slide. Then we have tips for selecting and implementing adaptation measures. And so one thing that I think people want is like I think people really crave like this document as like the final word of like, this is the adaptation measure to use when you're facing this problem. And unfortunately, we all wish it were that simple, but it's so dependent on the situation, the specific agency and what they can do, the specific site, the specific hazard, and how that looks to them. And so, there might be 2 transit agencies facing the same hazard, say sea level rise, and the right answer for the first transit agency is very different from the right answer for the other agency. And so unfortunately, there's no there's no prescription or recipe for how to select these things, but there's a lot of different things to keep in mind once you have an idea of potential ways to address this. So this resource provides these tips. We talk about how there's different types of cost of adaptation measures. And so this is so when you're weighing it and you say, oh, that one's really expensive and this one's not, it's really, there's different types of costs. So it's maybe not quite as clear cut. So think through well, there's these upfront costs, but there's also the annual maintenance costs or operational costs to sustain those adaptation measures. There's also avoided costs. So maybe there's more costs up front, but you're avoiding a lot of maintenance or repair costs down the road, and how to think through how to take that into account. And again, there's no wrong or right answer, but it's just as you're looking at different measures, some are going to have pros and cons in each one of those types of costs. We talk about different ways to achieve resilience, and so this gets back to it's not all about just protecting and avoiding, but usually it's a blend of different types of adaptation strategies. So we try to reduce our exposure in some ways, but we also try to improve the way that we react to events when they happen and recover from them. We talk about how some investments are needed now, but some can wait. They shouldn't be forgotten, and so that's a point that we try to make, that sometimes people get overwhelmed, oh my gosh, we have to make all these investments and we have no money, and it's just why do you even bother trying? And the message you're trying to think through, okay, well, what really truly does have to happen in the near term, and which ones don't really need to happen until we know that there's actually a problem or the problem is actually manifesting. Maybe it's a couple of decades down the road. So how do we identify which ones are which? And how do we make sure we don't forget about that? We identify and say, okay, we know that this measure probably needs to be implemented in 15 years or so. It doesn't have to be implemented now, but what are we monitoring to know that okay, something is triggered and now is the time to actually go and implement this. So that's just not forgotten about. We talk again a little more detail about how to manage uncertainty. That gets to actually, getting back to the decisions that you're making and how to not be intimidated by the uncertainty. And again, it gets back to identifying what to do now versus what can wait, and how to do things gradually. So it's not about really just seeing a whole list of investments that have to happen tomorrow. It's okay to start small. It's sometimes great to start small, actually. So again, we don't have to do everything all at once, but sometimes you start making these small changes and then you get a little more momentum and then do things gradually. And sometimes it's just, the most important thing is just to start, to get started. And then the momentum will carry you forward. And then we have a section on effective communications, because really that can make all the difference sometimes when you're seeking support for your resilience efforts. We have a lot of tips that we've learned over the past years about how to get people within your agency engaged, how to make the case when you're going to your board or CEO or the public so that they're supporting what you're doing, because having them on board, that truly makes all the difference sometimes when you're trying to get support for what you're doing. So you would use this resource when you're developing the adaptation plan or just trying to decide which adaptation measures to start prioritizing and pursuing. Next slide. Okay,
Right.
any questions on that?
Yeah, look at the Beth. There's one from Iris, which I can take actually, Beth, to give you a bit of a break if that's all right with you.
Sure.
Yeah, she's asked, other than the horizon year, what are some best practices to ensure consistency when using different data sources? So my top of mind reaction to that is to think about what decision you're trying to support, actually, and which is really the heart of this toolkit, and working back from that. For example, if you're looking at a piece of infrastructure that is critical, and again, there's tools that we've developed that can help you assess criticality. So let's assume that you've gone through that process. I think it's tools 4 and 5. That you've said, right, that is a critical piece of infrastructure. We really need that to be robust in the face of climate change. What then that does is that then leads you to thinking, well, we need to look at the worst case scenarios that have been developed through the climate change projections. So you're both looking at potentially long term, so like a long horizon year into the future, but you're also thinking about worst case in that situation. So again, our experience through the development of the toolkit is to sort of think backwards, is to think from the decision and then think through what that then means in terms of ensuring that there's consistency in the data that you're picking at the top end. Beth, is there anything you want to add to Iris' question?
Yeah, I think that helps. I think that's a good response, and I think it's, ideally we want everyone using consistent data sources, but at the same time, I wouldn't want anyone to get too hung up on it. So if the agency next door to them is using a different data source, honestly, a lot of times the trends are really similar. So you may get slightly different numbers that are projected, but generally, in my experience, it doesn't really change the ultimate trend. So, one might project an, additional 3 weeks of extreme heat days, and another might project an additional 2.5 weeks. Either way, it's a lot of additional hot days during summer of extreme heat. So, I think that's just one thing to keep in mind is that, in an ideal world, everything would be consistent, but it doesn't necessarily have to be, and it certainly shouldn't slow anyone down from taking action.
Yeah, good point. It's a matter of being transparent in just ensuring, Iris, that whatever approach is taken, that again that's clear. You've used a particular type of data. You've documented where that's from, and when you downloaded it, and so on, because as you know, this the information is evolving quickly. Okay, great. Look, I'm not seeing any other questions, so perhaps let's move on, Beth, to the last group.
Okay, great. Okay, so this is moving toward implementation, which in my mind is kind of the exciting part. But you do have to go through everything else to get here. But like I said, you're probably going to see more resources in general in the industry related to implementation in the coming years. But we're excited to be able to provide some right away for you guys. So this one has 3 resources. It's the Climate Resilience Planning Template, a Contingency Plan Template, and a Transit Resiliency Funding Opportunity Guide. Next slide. So it's pretty straightforward. It's a basic template for planning climate resiliency. And the reason we developed this resource is that we really want our adaptation plans to turn into meaningful action and not just a report that sits on a shelf. And so that's always a risk. Like, sometimes you get a one-time grant, there's a lot of enthusiasm around it. You do this really nice adaptation plan, but then nothing really happens, nothing really changes. Maybe there's not more resources. Maybe there just wasn't a plan of how to actually turn this into action. And so the way to avoid this is that you really need to articulate specific responsibilities to people and departments, and then break it down into near-term steps that then will lead into these longer-term goals, and just give yourselves deadlines and things like that. And that helps ensure the momentum is continued past the assessment phase. And so what this resource is just a simple template that helps it's kind of just fill in the blank and prompts you key things to think about. So that's articulating your near and your long-term goals. So, ultimately a long-term goal is probably, a more resilient climate, more resilient transit system, but that's so big and hard to break down. So let's talk about what's our really near-term goals then, and what do we hope to accomplish in the next year or the next 5 years? We have immediate next steps, and so that's always important. Again, if you think too long term, nothing really happens, but you can break it down into the immediate next steps. And also the roles and responsibilities, who specifically is responsible for those next steps. I think that can really go a long way in making sure that you're continuing to take action. And a general timeline for key adaptation milestones. And so that's, thinking through, okay, well, what can we realistically accomplish in the next 3 months, in the next 6 months, next year, next 3 years? And so kind of prompting you to lay that out. And so then, every time you meet internally, you can sort of weigh your progress against those milestones and adjust course if you're not on target. And that you would use this resource as you're undertaking the resilience planning process. Next slide. So here's just an example. It might be a little hard to read on the slide, but we do have an example that's on the website. So we list the long, near-term objectives, longer-term ones. The immediate next steps are spelled out, and how they relate to the different goals and what the deadline is that you assign yourself. So it's nothing that's prescriptive, but it's just a template to help you sort of spell these things out for yourselves. Next slide. There's a contingency plan template. And so, some transit agencies might already have contingency plans. Some may not have them in a very formalized way. So we have a template, or they may not really relate to climate change, but we do have a template that helps kind of just spell out the contingency plans. So, both prepare for, but also cope with and respond to disruptive events. In this case, climate-related events. And so this is, again, it's a template that you can use. It has draft language in there that you can customize. And you can use this as part of planning for those disruptive events. And this would be particularly useful if you know, for example, you're expecting a significant increase in, say, heat waves, or you're really concerned about flooding during extreme precipitation events in your area. Going back to that very first resource we talked about, it might show you which particular areas of your transit system are particularly vulnerable to, a sea level or a coastal event, so storm event on the coast, or inland flooding during a really heavy rain event. And so what's your plan for the potential disruptions that could happen during this? Next resource. So this is on transit resiliency funding opportunities, because that's always a question. People say, well, show me the money. I can't do anything without money. So we understand it's critical. The great thing about being a transit agency in California is that California actually has a lot of money that they're putting towards resiliency planning. So that's great. Very good news. It's, there's unfortunately not one-stop shop for it. So you have to go out and find it. There's a lot of grant funds that are becoming available. So this document, it's about a year old, so it's not going to stay relevant forever, but a lot of these programs are still relevant today. So as you start thinking through what you want to do and how to plan for resilience, it's helpful to look through the summary of grant opportunities and how to start applying for them. Okay, next slide. All right.
Yeah, Beth. So I'm not seeing any questions for the last batch. And perhaps I could ask a question selfishly while we're
Definitely.
while we're thinking about it. I mean, we've been talking about this. Start with the end in mind. I mean, what's your advice if you're a newbie to using the toolkit? Would you advise that you start with reading number 1, or would you start reading numbers 10 and 12, or perhaps 9, 10, and 12 first, and then go from there? What's your advice?
Well, that's a good question, and I don't think it's kind of all of them, right? So I think that very last resource may be helpful to look at early on, just to get a sense of like, oh gosh, there's these grants, and if you have a grant in mind, money to go after, it's good to understand what the deadlines are and what information would be needed to go after it. So that would help with that scoping step. So you don't necessarily have to keep that resource until the very end. Sometimes that is like the end that you're keeping in mind is applying for this grant. So it's a good thing to look through. I think that very first resource, honestly, is a great thing. We purposely put it as number 1 because it's just such a quick way to look and just get a visceral sense of like, gosh, this is how climate change is going to affect me. That even if you do go back and you end up needing more data or more specificity, you at least have a starting point of like, gosh, I really need to worry about heat, or I really need to worry about precip or sea level rise or what. And holy cow, these parts of my transit system are going to be exposed, but these other parts aren't. So, I think it really provides that perspective of what to focus on early on. But in general, I think all of the resources, it's worth kind of just paging through and thinking through, as you're just getting this sense. Sometimes you just have to noodle through things as you're thinking it out in your mind about like really what you want to accomplish with this, whether it's an assessment that you're doing or some other initiative within your agency.
Thanks, Beth.
Mm-hmm.
Well, look, I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat box, so perhaps we'll just move on to the last slide, which is the thank you slide, which has my email address on there, robert.kay@icf.com, and Beth's email address there, beth.roadhorst@icf.com. And with that, I'm going to give the mic back to you, India, and with my thanks to all of you here in SCAG HQ.
Yeah, thanks, Rob.
Thank you, Robert and Beth. And we are going to be moving to a presentation by Greg Asher on the SCAG Regional Adaptation Plan project.
Good morning, everyone. It's Greg Asher with the SCAG Sustainability Department. And so it looks like we've got the slides already, India. Okay. So I'm going to be talking a little bit, as I mentioned earlier in the Q&A, about our latest adaptation planning work. And that is that SCAG is preparing a regional adaptation planning framework to assist local jurisdictions throughout the region. So as most of you know, there are approximately 200 local jurisdictions, counting the cities and counties in the SCAG region. And as you can imagine, the amount of climate change and adaptation and resiliency planning across so many jurisdictions, it varies widely. So there are cities that have done quite a bit of work, and there are cities that haven't even begun to do any work, and then everybody else in between. So we're trying to create some mapping tools and some helpful guides that can get cities, just as Beth and Rob and Matt were talking about, to sort of jumpstart getting transit agencies to think about adaptation and resiliency planning. We want to get cities and counties thinking about adaptation and resiliency planning. And so this work is funded by a Caltrans SB1 grant. And so we'll be doing this over about the next 15 to 18 months. And we'll be reaching out to all the local jurisdictions. And so anyone listening today, if you want to have any additional questions, feel free to contact me. My contact information will be, I believe, on the last slide. And if you're interested in participating in any way, so we'll be doing pop-up events, surveys, workshops. And if you think your city or county offices would be interested in participating in some way, please let us know. We're always happy to work with volunteers, and it really doesn't matter whether you're well advanced in adaptation or resiliency planning, or you're just thinking of how to get started. So I'm going to give an overview of the tasks and what the study is going to include, or the series of studies. So first, we will be doing quite a bit of outreach. Obviously, I mentioned that we'd be reaching out to cities. So we have two basic tasks here. We're going to be reaching out to the jurisdiction. So that's the green box. But we're also going to be doing a little bit of outreach to the public. This isn't going to be the kind of effort where we do 30 regional workshops just open to the public, but we are going to be trying to selectively reach out to the public and try and identify good ways of communicating and finding out what concerns are among the public so that we can help the cities understand that as well. So with the public, we're going to be doing a number of focus groups around the region, at least a few in each county. And we're also going to be doing interviews with advocacy groups. And again, since we're a regional agency, we try and reach out to all 6 of our counties and do activities and planning efforts throughout the region. And both the focus groups and the individual interviews will be to help us understand potential messaging and communication strategies. And not so much for SCAG to know, but what we want to do is try and summarize that, do the background research, and find out what people in the SCAG region actually think about these issues, and then communicate that information to the cities, since the cities and counties more directly through their local elected officials as well as their staff, they're the ones on the ground meeting with their community members. And we want them to understand, okay, here are some good techniques for communicating with your residents and your businesses about about adaptation and resiliency. So we are also going to be doing a series of pop-up events, probably about a dozen around the region at different types of venues and events. That's another way for us just to reach more of the general public, and having a series of maps and graphics and sort of interactive types of information gathering. And again, so we're going to be talking, asking them, so how much do you know about climate change? What are your concerns about climate change? What do you think, is your local government doing something to help with climate change? Perhaps as your state government, do you think there should be other things done? And just a variety of techniques to try and tease out where people are in the SCAG region with these pop-up events. Now with the jurisdictional outreach, so this is with the cities and counties, so this is mainly staff. We're going to be doing an extensive survey, and we're also doing focus groups. We're going to be doing cities linked together by different risk categories. So we'll be interviewing a series of cities, say, that are on the coast, so we can understand what they're thinking about or planning for sea level rise. We'll be doing inland cities. We'll be doing areas where there's fire danger. And then we're also going to be doing sort of so those would be with risk categories, but we're also going to try and work with, do other focus groups where we're looking at, say, smaller cities to find out maybe there are a specific set of problems and strategies and concerns that smaller cities might have, say, versus the largest cities in the region. And so we're going to be looking at their capacity to address adaptation and resiliency, as well as do they have any interest in starting outreach with their local business community or their citizens, and trying to find out when they're thinking of updating their general plans and specific plans and how they might address adaptation and resiliency in their upcoming planning exercises. So in addition to the focus groups, we're also going to interview several dozen cities. And again, sort of breaking them down, we'll mix it up with risk categories like fire or sea level rise, but also with specific types of cities, inland cities, rural cities, mountain cities, and try and understand what some of the differences are across the region. So that we as SCAG in the future can hopefully reach out and help cities overcome some of those obstacles. So I think Matt and I mentioned earlier that we would like to use, for instance, our GIS department, and maybe we could overlay on a jurisdictional specific kind of map what the particular risks categories are in that community, and then look at some specific topic like transportation. But potentially we could also do that with water or with power or roadways and a number of other techniques. So this is really helping SCAG also build up our capacity internally with a lot of specific adaptation and resiliency mapping and data, so that we can be providing that back to the cities who and people who have specific questions or needs that they need to be met. So the outcome of all that will be a series of reference guides and toolkits, similar to what we've heard about earlier today. And so we'll be documenting the results and sharing best practices of this whole outreach process. And let's see, I don't have in my slides anything about chat room, India. So I don't know if somebody wants to ask a question if they want to, they can just jump in there and you can just let me know if I need to take a break and answer something. Yeah. Perfect, thanks. So just to get into a little bit more detail, the outreach, so we'll be doing the focus groups and the interviews. The intent is to try and understand the strengths and weaknesses of potential messaging strategies. We'll be contacting advocacy groups, both environmental justice groups, people who work with communities, community-based organizations, and again, to find out if they're working with climate change and adaptation issues, even if they're not, how they reach out to disadvantaged populations within their jurisdictions. And so those are going on now, and they'll continue. Actually, it says mid-May, but they'll be going on through, I think, probably about mid-June. And then the pop-up events, those will be coming later in the summer. And they're more, instead of specific groups, they're identified to sort of interact with the general public at public events like farmers markets and other types of events, and just to engage people on climate change, adaptation, what they see as vulnerabilities in their community, et cetera. And with the cities, again, now we want to try and find out specifically what cities think, what they think their capacity is, what their understanding is of adaptation and resiliency, and their planning experience. If they've already been doing this for a number of years, perhaps they've been applying for grants and doing their own studies, then they've got some experience already, and other cities do not have that experience. So we want to just understand where cities are and what their needs are, and how they intend to, or if they intend to address some of these moving forward, and what they think maybe they would need assistance with. Maybe it's outreach to their local communities. Maybe it's just getting an understanding of what adaptation and resiliency is. And maybe it's getting some capacity or experience, maybe sharing of information with neighboring jurisdictions, or having webinars such as this, just to help bring certain staff people at the cities, bring their knowledge level up. So another major task we're going to be doing is risk and vulnerability mapping. So we heard a little bit about that earlier, which we started with the transit project. So we'll be continuing that. Of course, since last year wildfire was, the region was particularly hard hit with wildfires. That's very high concern among the communities right now. So we'll be looking at, there's a lot of, in this field, as Beth mentioned, there's new mapping, there's new data every year, there's new tools. So it's a very fast-moving environment. But we're going to be trying to look at the latest data on wildfire risks, sea level rise, extreme precipitation, flood risk, mudslides, and trying to map that and overlay those, because sometimes what you start with is the wildfire risk. Then you get the extreme precipitation, which then precipitates some mudslides. And of course, the disaster last year in Santa Barbara County was sort of that in spades. So we want to take a look and provide mapping and data to see, so communities can understand. Some communities may be at the base of some very steep slopes and not really fully aware that if there were a fire, with some of the after effects that could happen, and maybe they need to be addressing some of those concerns sooner rather than later. And then we're going to be looking at the impacts of these different risks. So how many dwelling units, what's the population, the jobs, the land area, for instance, all in, say, the wildfire risk areas, or sea level rise again, or in the flood risk areas, so that we have a sense of how many tens of thousands of units are threatened by this particular risk, and jobs and population and transportation infrastructure. So here are some, so we're working on the mapping now. Here are just some examples that we're testing various models. So here are two, for instance, that talk about sea level rise, the Cosmos model and the CalFlow-D, which is in CalAdapt. And there are differences. I think Beth made an important point. Even though cities, and there are a lot of different models for all risks out there, they all generally point in the same direction. And so whether a city uses, one, Huntington Beach could use one of these models, Costa Mesa could use one of the other models. They're both going to show significant sea level rise and significant damage in the future. And whether it's, both models will point in the same direction, and there are several other models as well. So currently we're testing those to find how we can be consistent with state level data and mapping, and sort of what seems to work best for the SCAG region. And we'll be testing these and showing these to various cities and local jurisdictions to see what's helpful for them. And then we'll be providing this mapping capability, as well as the data sort of on a regional level, which for us would be both county and by jurisdiction. So you would be able to go in as a city and take a look at your risks and take a look at several models of what that looks like. And so just continuing, so here on the left is a wildfire risk map from CAL FIRE. There are several of these out there, and then there's flood risk and extreme precipitation, and there are several of those. So we're just working to, now you will notice on here, we're doing this on urban footprint, which enables us, because SCAG uses urban footprint as one of our planning tools. And it does allow us to look at the demographics and the population characteristics city by city. So you can zoom in, and then you'd see these various overlays. You could then pick whichever risk you were interested in looking at for your city. And so here's just the type of data that we get out of that. So what this is just a sample which shows the different counties and what the major risks are. So I think what you can see here is the fire risk is quite significant across, perhaps less so in Orange County, where flood hazard zones are a more serious risk. And then you can see sea level rise really only impacts Orange, Ventura, and Los Angeles. So it's showing, and then the number of people that are affected by each of those risk categories. So this is the type of data that we'll be collecting. And here it is for fire zones. So then we're also looking at how, as a region, we can coordinate together, because, as has been mentioned earlier, adaptation and resiliency really don't, they're implemented mainly at a local or county level, but the risks are not limited to city boundary lines. So obviously, cities up and down a water course need to coordinate on drainage and water and potential flooding. Communities up in the mountains need to realize that the wildfire is just going to jump from town to town to town. So there needs to be this ability to coordinate at a greater than just a single jurisdiction level. So we're going to be talking to the cities and about what strategies they already have in place and how they think they could do better, identifying gaps and working together. I think Beth had earlier mentioned the OES, which is the State Office of Emergency Services. Typically, cities are used to coordinating sort of at a public safety level, but they're not always used to coordinating on a planning level. There's some transportation planning with the county transportation commissions, which is bigger than, which helps coordinate transportation strategies on a more than a city level. But there definitely needs to, we definitely want to help identify the gaps and close those gaps to facilitate regional planning on these adaptation and resiliency strategies. So that'll be important. And there are a number of ways of doing that. There are several multi-step processes which help cities walk their way through identifying their risks and prioritizing their resources. And so we'll be helping cities identify where they are on that cycle. And of course, SCAG, we're a transportation and land use agency. So we want to particularly have a focus on how do these risk categories affect the regional transportation system. So obviously, we really drilled down deep on the transit agencies side here with the study that we were talking about earlier. And Caltrans is taking a look at their regional highway network in the region. But that leaves a lot of other transportation issues that need to be looked at, everything from bridges to roads and et cetera. So we're going to be taking a look at how land use, where transportation vulnerabilities are, how land use either benefits or takes away from that or adds to that vulnerability. And then we're going to actually run our travel demand model to say, all right, to making some scenarios like, all right, let's assume there's major fires in a certain area. What happens to the traffic during that period of time? What if the roadways are closed for one day or a month or several months if there's flooding and it wipes out bridges? And we want to see what happens both with congestion and traffic patterns. And then we want to take a look at the land use to find out where, as I mentioned earlier, where populations are vulnerable, and how certain land uses at certain locations might be more or less desirable. So that would be the most obvious example would be, do you build in a floodplain? And if not, what do you do to mitigate for that? So maybe you build at 10 feet above the floodplain. So we want to be taking a look at where the land use vulnerabilities are as well. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, some cities are already incorporating adaptation and resilience in their general plans and other plans that they have. Most cities are not. That's anecdotally that we've looked at over the last few years. So we will be working with cities to develop model language for that they can insert and modify and put in their next general plan update, or if they have other planning documents that they want to update specific plans, and then as well as the local coastal plans for the coastal cities. And so this will be the type of template where a city can pretty much sort of if they want to do it very simply, they can sort of fill in their name and some of their local language, or they can just use it as a framework and identify their own language. But it's a starting point for staff to say, all right, how do we insert adaptation and resilience language in our safety plan or in our land use plan? So yes, we'll be working with the sub-regional COGs on this. We'll also be working with building and planning departments to develop checklists. So when people come in for projects, they can fill out some type of a survey, and they can so the city has some sense of is this project have resiliency features built in? Does it have adaptation planning? Might be as simple as their drainage plan, or it might be something more complex, such as a microgrid for a larger project. So it's really to get the departments, the actual line departments at cities, thinking about and beginning to think how they can ask questions and help projects become more resilient and adapting to a changing climate, and how they can start sort of building so future buildings and future land uses are more resilient and are not contributing to adaptation problems, but are actually helping solve those for future residents. And just sort of, here's just a series of tools. I won't go into these in much detail, but we're going to be looking at a gap analysis, preparing a gap analysis of the variety of plans that have been done around the region by cities and where we see some gaps. So there might be a lot of, well, I think what Matt had originally noticed is that a lot of the transit agencies did not have this type of planning. So that was a gap, and then we're trying to meet that gap. So we're going to be looking to see, you know, for instance, the ports have done a lot of work over the last few years. So they're continuing, they're active in this area, so there probably isn't a big gap. They may have some specific studies they want to do, but they're actively looking to be more resilient in the future and addressing adaptation concerns now. But that's not true across the board. There might be a lot of different agencies or city departments or cities that really don't have much work yet, and we want to try and find out, okay, what are the greatest needs for adaptation and resiliency planning in the SCAG region. I've already talked about the interactive mapping tool. We will be doing a finance and funding workshop. I think, as Beth mentioned, everybody's interested in where the money is to do this work and to start adapting your infrastructure. So we'll be taking a fresh look at that, and probably in a webinar, but also in an in-person workshop later in the fall. For our fellow MPOs, that's metropolitan planning organizations around the state, we're engaged with them already on adaptation and resiliency planning. We're trying to develop a set of joint principles and metrics so that the largest MPOs are basically working hand in hand with the same type of principles, and maybe we agree on some tools and some data sources. So that there's a little bit of consistency throughout the state, covering, when you take the 4 largest MPOs, I think that's about 70 to 80% of the state's population. So we'd like to contribute to that space. Again, we're going to be making a spreadsheet toolkit so a local city can identify pretty much the same process as Beth identified earlier, that you need to sort of list what you think are your greatest risks and vulnerabilities, then you have to prioritize them, and this will be a simple way for a city to start that process. So they can say, okay, here are 20 things we're concerned about. 10 of these are a high priority. 3 of them are a really high priority. So that's what we need to look for funding for. And then we also, as SCAG, we don't have a good sense. Actually, no one in the region really has a good tool, or we don't have the data on all of the adaptation and resiliency work going on in the region. So we are going to start tracking that. That's a huge task, if anyone can imagine, because a lot of cities may be doing adaptation or resiliency work. They don't call it that, but they may have done something to their city hall to make it more energy efficient or less prone to fire, or that, and they just think of it as a good common sense measure that they're doing, and they may not list it as an adaptation or a resiliency measure. So we're going to try and get a sense of not every local project, but all of the major ones around, and try and keep track of that over the years so we can really measure how, what kind of progress we're making and if we identify any gaps. So we'd love to have any involvement, so please contact me, as I mentioned. So near-term involvement are the interviews, focus groups. If you want to make sure that we will be doing an online survey. If you want to make sure that it will be on our website, but if you want to be notified of when that's available, please let me know. And here, Cambridge Systematics is the lead on our consulting team that's assisting us. But here's my my contact information, which is Asher, A-S-H-E-R, at scag.ca.gov. And I would love to talk to you. And if anyone has any questions, happy to answer.
Haven't seen any questions yet.
Rob always has a question.
Yeah, I was just curious. I mean, the next opportunities for engagement for those that are on the line, and there seems to be multiple points of opportunities.
Yeah, no, great point. I didn't. I think it was in there a couple of times, but I didn't pull it out. So we have created SCAG has a series of working groups that meet quarterly on a variety of topics. So we have a transit working group, we have a sustainability working group. We have an environmental justice working group. What else? What else do we have, Matt? I'm missing something there, I'm sure.
I think there's new mobility and active transportation.
Yes, right.
Yeah,
so we have a number of
environmental justice.
Yeah, so these are open to the public meetings. We invite, mailing lists range in the several hundreds, and we have quarterly meetings here at SCAG, and we also broadcast them, on a WebEx type of thing, so people don't have to come in. They can sit at their desks and listen to the meetings, and all of these involve outside speakers and topics and that. So SCAG has committed to having, an ongoing group and dialogue on adaptation and resiliency going forward. So that's one really easy way. So this study will sort of come and go. These focus groups will come and go, but that working group is a way for people to stay engaged over the long term, and they can bring issues or concerns, and we'll try and find speakers, and we'll talk about a variety of topics and present a variety of materials. And I'm just assuming that since this is a long-term threat to the region, that this group will be ongoing. There will be plenty of opportunity in the future to engage with other cities and like-minded people and advocates and everyone.
Right.
So thank you. Great question, Rob. So anything else, India? No?
Greg, can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
I'm wondering, since you're working with jurisdictions as well as other kinds of agencies, have you thought much about the balance between adaptation planning for agency-owned assets, which is what we mostly focused on in our effort, versus adaptation planning to protect residents and businesses? Is there different concerns that local jurisdictions have to think about in that sense?
Yes. And some cities might focus more on, say, a neighborhood. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, some of the coastal cities have neighborhoods that are very low-lying areas and in the future would be subject to sea level rise. And some of those are wealthy neighborhoods, some of those are economically challenged neighborhoods. So a city there might have two different population groups, and they may be very concerned about not so much the assets, but sort of the long-run health or safety or resilience of those neighborhoods. Other cities might have maybe some particular infrastructure, some hard asset that is actually maybe their greatest concern. So they may have a particular bridge that's 80% of their traffic, the people coming and leaving are going through, or they may be vulnerable to fires or winds, or, and they may have some highway that could get knocked out easily. Both Long Beach and LA have large ports, so those are hard assets. So some cities are going to have more of that focus on addressing the assets. Maybe their neighborhoods aren't really their greatest concerns currently. So that has all to do with sort of that risk analysis and the vulnerabilities and talking about that. And so as you and I both know, working in planning, that so we start with a list and we say, okay, so you could imagine a city planner saying, okay, here I've identified 6 things. Well, depending on that person's background, maybe all of those were hard assets. Maybe when that gets brought to a planning commission or a city manager or the city council, somebody says, well, yeah, that list, you're right, those 6 things, we should address those, but you forgot the neighborhood or the social concern. And so then they're going to so other people will contribute over time to a city addressing sort of a variety of needs. It's never going to start off with sort of the complete perfect plan or map or list. It's going to be iterative. So part of our gap analysis is going to just be looking at, trying to say, okay, so maybe at the end of this study, we'll say 80% of cities in the SCAG region are particularly concerned with hard assets, and only 20% raise the issue of neighborhoods or social assets. Or we could find the opposite. We really don't know. So for us, it'll be sort of a learning experience, and then everybody will say, oh, okay, so yes, we as a city, we're also mainly concerned with hard assets. But now, after seeing some of this work, we realize, oh, we should also be concerned about some of the social aspects in the neighborhood. So we're hoping it'll just generally raise awareness and get people thinking about sort of the whole range of prospects.
All right, let me see. Looks like there's no more questions, but
all right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for participating. We will have the PowerPoints available online, and I can also email them to you, as well as a recording of the webinar. So I'll be sending out the link to that once it's up. And thank you.
Thanks, India.